The diner was barely waking up when Ethan Cole walked in, the kind of early hour when people move slow and carry yesterday's weight on their shoulders. Nobody knew that the man in the worn jacket, head slightly lowered, was the same billionaire whose decisions shaped thousands of paychecks across the country, and nobody knew why someone like him would choose a place like this, or why he ordered the cheapest meal on the menu with a voice that carried both caution and intent. He sat quietly, notebook tucked beside his arm as if guarding a secret too heavy for casual eyes. The title of the moment echoed in his mind like a warning, reminding him that what he was doing could change everything one day. He watched the diner with the focus of someone waiting to catch something slipping, searching for cracks in people's behavior, curious about how workers treated those who looked like they had little to offer. There was a tension in the air around him, the kind that comes from someone who has lived too long behind numbers and wants to know what lies beyond them. Yet even before his food arrived, two questions began to take shape in the back of his mind, questions he wasn't ready to face. Why did he feel strangely exposed sitting here, and what was he hoping to find in people he no longer understood? Ethan's eyes followed every small interaction inside the diner, and his pen moved with quiet precision, logging details that most people would never care to notice. The tired mother who rubbed her forehead while her two kids argued over syrup. The older man with shaky hands who smiled too big at the smallest kindness. The teenager who worked behind the counter, yawning but still trying to stay upbeat. Ethan wrote down their behavior because he was convinced that pressure made workers better, that strict rules forced the best out of anyone, that metrics were the only fair way to measure a person's effort. But as he filled his page, something heavy pressed in on him. Something he had learned to ignore during years of running a company from boardrooms far removed from daily life. It felt like an empty space inside him, the kind that grows when success builds walls instead of bridges. He had everything people dream about, yet very little felt real anymore. He knew it even if he never admitted it. That emptiness kept scratching at him, whispering that the world he created might be missing something he could not name. And somewhere deep inside he sensed that this simple morning experiment could reveal a truth he had avoided for too long, a truth that would not let him hide once it surfaced. When Maya approached his table, Ethan expected the same routine he saw everywhere in his companies, a polite smile followed by forced upselling and subtle pressure to spend more. Instead, her warm greeting carried no trace of calculation, and her eyes lingered on him with genuine concern, as if trying to understand what kind of day he was having before even asking. She noticed he looked tired, maybe even older than he should, and she made small conversation that felt oddly comforting. Ethan noticed immediately that she asked nothing about upgrades or extras, nothing about deals or larger portions. In fact, she seemed more focused on making him feel seen than making him spend another dollar. Her behavior went against everything he trained his employees to do, every manual he approved, every performance model he believed in. Still, instead of frustration, he felt a strange sense of surprise, almost a quiet disbelief that someone would choose kindness over profit, even when no one was watching. That single moment unsettled him more than he expected. If someone like her could break the rules so naturally, what did that say about the rules themselves? And why did her simple warmth shake him in a way money never could? Ethan barely had time to gather his thoughts before Maya returned, placing a small kid's dessert next to his plate with a soft smile that carried more sincerity than he had seen in years. She didn't make a show of it and didn't wait for thanks. She simply said, "For later, when the day gets heavy," as if she understood something he hadn't told a soul. Ethan froze, stunned by the gentle, unmeasured kindness of the gesture. There was no supervisor watching, no reward for her actions, no metric that would ever reflect it. Yet she gave him something extra anyway, something small but full of meaning, something he couldn't reason away with charts or profit margins. For a moment he felt disoriented, as if the ground beneath his worldview shifted an inch without warning. A warmth crept into him, unfamiliar and unsettling. He looked at the dessert, then at her walking away, and a question quietly formed inside him, one he had avoided for far too long. When did he stop believing people could act from the heart? And more importantly, what else had he stopped seeing while chasing efficiency? Ethan stayed longer than planned, unable to ignore the pull of what he was witnessing. He watched Maya help an elderly man carry his tray, offer a patient smile to a frustrated mother, and slip a comforting word to a young father counting coins as if every cent hurt. She moved with a grace that came from instinct, not training, giving more of herself than any manual could ever teach. Ethan felt his hand shaking as he held his notebook, realizing her behavior directly contradicted the system he had built over decades. Her kindness was not an exception. It was a challenge to everything he believed made a business strong. For the first time in years, he questioned whether he truly understood people, or whether he had been shaping them into something smaller than they were meant to be. That realization hit him harder than any boardroom crisis. By the time he closed his notebook, he knew he could not leave this diner unchanged. He made a quiet decision to study Maya not as a subject of an experiment, but as someone who might hold answers he had forgotten to seek. And from that moment, whether he liked it or not, his world would never return to the one he walked in with. Before we dive back into Ethan's quiet fight between everything he believed and everything Maya is showing him, pause the video for a second and drop a comment saying where you're watching from or if you've ever met someone whose kindness changed your whole day. Seriously, pause it and comment now, so we can keep the story going together. Ethan stayed in that corner booth longer than he wanted to admit, pretending to focus on his notebook, even though his attention never drifted far from Maya. What had started as a simple test was already slipping out of his control, and he felt it in the strange tightness in his chest each time he saw her move toward another customer. The morning crowd grew heavier, full of tired faces and quiet worries, and Maya handled every moment as if she carried a light inside her that she kept sharing without a second thought. She covered for a coworker who seemed overwhelmed, stepping in with a smile that eased tension before a single word was spoken. She bent down to help a young dad who looked embarrassed as he counted change for a drink he couldn't afford, gently sliding a cup his way with a soft nod that told him she understood more than he was able to say. Ethan watched all of this unfold, trying to view her actions through the lens of his usual logic. But the more he observed her, the more his old rules slipped through his fingers. He had spent years believing pressure created excellence, yet here was someone proving excellence grew easiest where kindness lived. That realization stirred something in him that felt too big to ignore. Every time Ethan glanced at the other customers, he noticed how the mood of the entire diner lifted around her. Kids settled when she spoke gently to them. Older folks straightened with a little extra dignity when she treated them like they mattered. And even the most stressed customers softened under her calm presence. It wasn't just good service, it was something deeper, something he hadn't seen in so long that it almost felt foreign. He leaned over his notebook, trying to write objectively, but the words betrayed him. Every note he scribbled carried a warmth he didn't expect, a recognition that Maya was doing something powerful without even meaning to. When she hurried to refill coffee for a customer who never tipped, Ethan felt a strange mix of disbelief and admiration. She wasn't performing, she was connecting, and connection was the one thing he had removed from his business long ago. He felt the conflict growing inside him, like two worlds pulling in opposite directions, and he realized that watching her wasn't part of the experiment anymore. It was part of a lesson he hadn't asked for, but clearly needed. He kept his expression neutral when Maya checked on him again, asking if everything tasted all right, and he managed a nod that felt too small for the emotions rising inside him. The warmth of her presence lingered even after she walked away, making him painfully aware of how cold his own corporate scripts truly were. He looked down at his notebook again, the tip of his pen shaking slightly as he wrote the words that formed without permission. If she worked for me, she'd be reprimanded for this. The sentence hit him harder than expected, like a confession he didn't know he was ready to make. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the truth settle into him. For the first time, he wondered if the problem wasn't employees failing to meet expectations, but expectations that failed to meet people. And that thought carried a sting that made him sit back and breathe slow, trying to steady himself. The longer he stayed, the more he realized he couldn't walk away unchanged. Something about Maya's instincts, her small acts of generosity, her natural ability to brighten a room, all of it pushed against the rigid structure he had spent decades building. He wasn't angry. He was humbled, even grateful, though he didn't know how to express that yet. As he watched her wipe down a counter while humming softly to herself, he felt a sense of clarity forming, the kind that reveals a road you didn't know existed until someone guided you toward it. And right as he thought about closing his notebook for the day, he overheard something that froze him mid-breath, something that hinted he wasn't the only one wrestling with invisible weight, something that promised the next moment would change far more than he expected. Ethan noticed the shift before he understood it. The diner had picked up its lunch rhythm, a mix of hurried workers and families trying to stretch their budgets. A woman walked in, holding a toddler on one hip, and guiding a little boy with her free hand. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from carrying more worries than hours of sleep. When she sat down, Maya greeted her with the same calm tone she used with everyone, offering a small smile that softened the tension around the woman's eyes. Ethan watched closely, waiting to see whether Maya would follow the usual script he demanded in his companies, the one where a stressed parent was seen as an easy target for upselling. Instead, Maya simply asked what the woman needed today, listened as she hesitated over the price of an extra drink, and gently said, "Don't worry about it, I've got you." No sales push, no pressure, just care. Ethan felt a knot tighten inside him. His metrics would label Maya as a worker who leaves money on the table, someone who doesn't maximize transactions. Yet seeing the mother's relief, watching her shoulders drop as she finally breathed, he felt something different rising in him, something that told him Maya's instinct was worth more than any of his numbers. That contradiction pulled at him hard, making him sit straighter and look at her as if seeing a truth he'd been avoiding for years. The thought wouldn't leave him alone. He remembered boardrooms where compassion was treated like a weakness, where executives bragged about squeezing more out of customers, where empathy was something to be filtered out of training. He heard their voices in his head, laughing about how friendly never pays the bills, and he felt a heat rise in his chest that surprised him. Watching Maya now, he couldn't deny that her small act of understanding did more to lift the mother's spirit than any polished corporate strategy ever had. The diner itself seemed to shift when she moved, as if her presence made the whole room breathe easier. Ethan's pen hovered over the page before he wrote a note he never expected to confront, a confession tucked in the shape of a quiet whisper that slipped out before he could swallow it back. "Have I been leading people the wrong way?" The words hung in the air between him and his notebook, heavier than any financial report he had ever signed. He stared at them, feeling a pull deep inside, a tug at something human he had buried under profit charts and strict policies. That kind of moment, the one where a single sentence shakes the ground under someone's feet, is something many people feel when they realize the world isn't working the way they thought. And hearing this part of the story together, right now, creates a space where everyone listening can recognize that shift, that flicker of doubt that turns into something bigger. It's the kind of moment where people in the comments end up sharing stories of times they questioned their own beliefs, and others jump in to say they felt the same. That shared feeling is what makes this space feel like a community, rather than just a story playing on a screen. Ethan blinked slowly, as if giving his mind time to catch up with his heart. He replayed Maya's gesture in his head, not just the action, but the impact it had on the woman and her kids. It wasn't about money. It was about dignity. Something in him softened in a way that surprised him. He found himself grateful, genuinely grateful, that someone like her still existed in a world he had helped shape to be harsher than it needed to be. He watched as she checked on the family again, making sure the little boy had enough napkins and joking lightly with the toddler. The mother's face brightened, and Ethan felt the tiniest sting behind his eyes, the kind that comes from seeing something right when you realize how much wrong you've accepted. He wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but he felt something loosening inside him, a quiet recognition that kindness wasn't weakness, and that maybe the strongest people were the ones who lifted others without expecting anything in return. As the family began to settle into their meal, Ethan leaned back and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His mind raced with questions he wasn't prepared to answer, questions that pressed against the life he had built and the values he had enforced. He knew he was approaching a turning point, something that demanded honesty instead of habit, reflection instead of excuses. He watched Maya move with that quiet purpose again, and felt the tension in him shift into something that wasn't clarity yet, but wasn't denial either. It was the feeling that the next thing he learned, or overheard, or admitted to himself, could be the one that changed the direction of everything he thought he understood. Ethan stayed seated even after the family left, feeling the echo of his whispered question still pulsing in his chest. Maya walked by with a tray balanced on her hand, chatting with another server about the lunch rush picking up. He tried to focus on the way she spoke to people, the gentle rhythm in her voice, but something in him felt different now, as if the ground had shifted under his feet and he hadn't caught his balance yet. While she refilled drinks near the counter, he heard her co-worker sigh and complain about the pressure to sell more add-ons because the manager had hinted their numbers were low. Ethan leaned in without meaning to, curiosity pulling him closer. Maya answered in a calm tone, the kind that carried quiet conviction. She said people needed kindness, not pressure, and that sometimes giving them a little space was worth more than any bonus. Her words stopped him cold. They weren't dramatic or loud, but they landed like a mirror held up to his face, reflecting a truth he had tried hard not to see. He felt a strange burn in his chest, painful but honest, and he realized this moment wasn't about observation anymore. Something was happening to him, something he hadn't expected when he walked in here wearing a disguise and carrying a notebook. Her coworker laughed softly, not mocking her but surprised by her certainty. Maya just shrugged, saying life was already heavy for most folks, and pushing them for more money never truly helped anyone. Ethan stared at her, the noise of the diner fading behind the sound of her voice. He had heard executives dismiss compassion as weakness, but here it stood in front of him, steady and real, changing the atmosphere one gentle action at a time. The notebook in his hand suddenly felt too stiff, too cold, like a symbol of everything he no longer believed was right. He opened it, glanced at the notes written like data points on a spreadsheet, and for the first time since starting this experiment, he shut it with a quiet finality that startled him. That soft click felt like a turning point, a moment when something inside him stepped out of the shadows and demanded honesty. He closed his eyes for a second, breathing slowly, as if letting the truth settle where denial used to live. Moments like these have a way of shaping the rest of a person's path, even when they seem small at the time. And the choices made right after them often return later with a force nobody expects, weaving into decisions and consequences that feel bigger than the moment they came from. When Ethan opened his eyes again, he watched Maya with a different kind of attention, not as someone running an experiment, but as someone learning from a teacher he never knew he needed. He saw how she steadied a shaking hand when an older customer dropped a fork, how she used humor to lighten the mood for a truck driver frustrated with a late order, how she listened without rushing when the young dad from earlier thanked her quietly for helping him. These weren't accidents or lucky moments. They were choices, consistent and intentional, guided by a value system that didn't care about numbers on a report. Ethan felt gratitude rising in him, not because she did anything for him directly, but because she reminded him of a part of humanity he had pushed aside. He even felt a pinch of regret for the workers in his companies who might have wanted to be like her, but were trained to do the opposite. He thought back to conversations where he defended strict policies, telling himself he was building efficiency. Now he wondered how many good people he had unknowingly shut down, how many Mayas he had never met, because his rules stamped out the very thing that made service meaningful. His chest tightened at the thought, not with shame, but with an emerging understanding that he could choose something different. He wasn't ready to voice it yet, but the shift had already begun. He watched Maya wipe down a booth, humming faintly, and saw her as the mirror she had become, reflecting qualities he had forgotten mattered. As the diner quieted for a moment, he sensed that something essential was approaching, something that would force him to confront not just his policies, but the person he had allowed himself to become. And though he didn't know what that moment would look like, he felt the pull of it, steady and certain, waiting just ahead. Ethan noticed the man the moment he walked in, loud voice cutting through the soft clatter of plates and silverware. The customer slammed his menu down, complaining before anyone had time to greet him. Maya approached with that same steady calm Ethan had seen all morning, her voice warm even when the man barked at her about his order taking too long. She apologized without shrinking, standing just close enough to show respect, but not close enough to invite more hostility. The diner felt tight during the exchange, tension hanging like humidity before a storm, yet Maya never let it spill over. She listened, nodded, and returned with the corrections he demanded, moving with patience that didn't make sense to Ethan, not after everything she endured in just a few minutes. When she finally stepped away from the man, Ethan caught the small exhale she tried to hide, the quiet way she blinked back frustration before putting on another smile for the next table. It made something inside him twist, a slow ache rising as he watched her lift the room's weight with grace he didn't think possible. She went to check on another server, a nervous young woman carrying 2 plates that almost slipped from her hands. Maya stepped in without a word, steadying the tray and guiding her to the right table with a reassuring touch on the shoulder. The younger server mumbled an apology, and Maya whispered, "You're fine, really," before heading back toward the kitchen. Ethan followed her with his eyes, struck by how naturally she restored calm wherever she went. But the moment that cut deepest came when she reached the counter, leaned toward a co-worker and said softly, "Sorry I'm not fast enough today. I'll pick up the pace." The words were quiet, but they hit Ethan like a blow to the stomach. That wasn't her voice. That was his. The voice of the company he built. The pressure he placed on employees in boardrooms miles away from here. Hearing it from her lips turned the room colder instantly. He felt the weight of every rule he had enforced, every script that taught workers they were never enough, even when they were giving everything they had. She didn't say it out of duty. She said it out of fear. Ethan knew that tone too well. He had heard it in new hires during performance reviews, in managers during conference calls, in people who believed kindness was something they had to hide to keep their jobs. Watching her shrink herself in that small apology, he felt guilt wash over him so sharply he had to steady his breath. He remembered speeches he'd given about efficiency, about speed, about measurable value. He remembered the applause that followed, the pride he felt at numbers climbing on charts, never thinking about the people under those charts who carried the cost. And now here Maya was, proving she could lift an entire diner's spirit, yet still believing she wasn't enough because the world he helped shape had taught her that. Ethan pushed back from his booth slightly, suddenly wanting to stand, wanting to cross the space and tell her she was more than enough, that she was doing everything right, that her kindness mattered more than any metric he had ever created. The urge to reveal himself rose so quickly, he almost said her name out loud. His fingers pressed into the seat, ready to lift him toward her, ready to break the lie of his disguise. But when she turned, her hands full, her face still carrying the softness she fought to keep, he froze. Something inside him knew he wasn't ready, not because he feared her reaction, but because he feared he didn't yet understand the full truth of what needed to change. If he spoke now, he would bring his world crashing into hers without the wisdom to rebuild it. He sank back into the booth slowly, breath shaky, watching her walk away as the realization settled deeper. He had caused this weight on her shoulders, and he had no right to speak until he understood how to lift it. He stayed silent, feeling the tension in his chest shift into something heavier but clearer. For the first time, he wasn't just witnessing kindness. He was confronting the consequences of his own choices. Maya wasn't only the heart of this diner. She was the mirror reflecting the cracks in everything he believed made a business strong. And though the moment left him hollow, it also left him with a sense that this truth, as painful as it was, needed to come before any change could happen. Something had begun inside him, something he couldn't stop even if he tried, and he sensed there was still one missing piece waiting to fall into place before he would find the courage to step out of hiding and face the world he created. Ethan stepped outside because he couldn't breathe inside anymore. The diner door closed behind him, with a soft thud that felt louder than it should, like the world urging him to face something he'd been avoiding since the moment he first saw Maya slip that dessert onto his tray. The air outside was cooler, sharp enough to wake parts of him he spent years numbing with schedules and numbers and silent offices. He walked a few steps toward the sidewalk, trying to steady himself, trying to make sense of everything twisting inside his chest. But then he saw them, a small family huddled together at the bus stop, the mother rubbing her son's arms to warm him, the father staring at the road with that familiar look of worry mixed with hope. It was a picture he knew too well, a picture he once lived inside. He froze, his breath catching as memories he never invited came rushing back, memories of his own childhood waiting at a similar stop, cold, tired, unnoticed by people passing by with faster lives and fuller pockets. Standing there, watching that family, he felt something inside him crack deeper than before. He remembered how invisible he felt growing up, how adults brushed past him without seeing him, how kindness felt like a rare accident instead of a steady presence. And it hit him with painful clarity that the system he built, the one he defended his whole life, would have crushed someone like Maya just as easily as the world once crushed him. His policies rewarded pressure, not patience, performance, not people, fear, not gratitude, and the idea that Maya, someone who lifted others so naturally, would be punished in his empire made his stomach twist. He pressed a hand against the diner wall to steady himself as the truth settled heavy in his bones, a truth he could no longer push away or dress up with excuses. He turned his head slightly, seeing his reflection faintly in the diner window. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back. Not the billionaire, not the leader. Just a boy who once longed for someone to tell him he mattered, even when he couldn't offer anything in return. That boy had grown into a man who built an empire on rules meant to protect him from ever feeling small again. But in doing so, he had made other people feel small instead. The weight of that realization forced him to close his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were drawn back to the family at the bus stop. The mother caught him looking and offered a tired smile, the kind people give when they're trying not to fall apart. It broke him. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deep inside where the strongest walls usually stand. Ethan whispered the words before he realized he'd spoken them. "I built this wrong." The sound of it felt both terrifying and freeing. It was the closest thing to an apology he had spoken in years. Not to Maya, not to his workers, but to himself, to the younger version of him who once believed kindness mattered, then taught himself it didn't. A warmth rose in his chest, not gentle this time, but heavy, like grief mixed with clarity. He wanted to march back inside and tell Maya everything, thank her for showing him what real strength looked like, promise he would fix every broken piece of the world he created. But he knew he couldn't walk in unprepared. Change born out of emotion alone collapses. He needed direction, he needed courage, and he needed to face the mirror fully before he faced her truthfully. He stayed there for a few breaths, letting the cold air steady him, letting the memory of his past mix with the reality of his present. Something in him had shifted, not slightly but completely, like a door opening into a room he never allowed himself to enter. He knew he couldn't go back to who he was when he walked into that diner. He also knew Maya had become the compass guiding him towards something better, even if she didn't know it yet. Moments like this make people rethink their whole lives. If you were standing there in Ethan's shoes, would you fight to fix everything, or walk away from the pressure of changing so much? Let me know what you'd do, and if you're feeling the story so far, make sure you stick around and subscribe so we can keep exploring these powerful moments together. He turned back toward the diner, watching the warm light spilling through the windows, a light that suddenly felt like an invitation. One chapter of him had ended right there on that sidewalk, and another was waiting just inside, ready to begin. The night wasn't heavy yet, but he knew it was coming, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. Ethan stood outside the diner for a long moment before returning, feeling the weight of his realization settle deeper with every breath. The cold morning air clung to him, as if trying to steady him for what he was about to do. He no longer had the disguise that shielded him, no flannel jacket, no worn hat pulled low. He looked like himself again, the man the world recognized, the man whose presence usually made boardrooms sit straighter and investors lean in. But for the first time in years, he felt exposed in a way his wealth could not protect. When he stepped back inside, he felt the shift instantly. The diner's warmth wrapped around him, the smell of fresh coffee and pancakes rising like a quiet welcome he wasn't sure he deserved. And then he saw her, Maya, moving between tables with that same natural grace, unaware that the moment she looked up, her life would tilt in a direction she never asked for. His steps felt heavier as he approached her, each one echoing with the memory of the words he whispered outside. "I built this wrong." That truth stood between them, silent but unavoidable. When she finally turned toward him, recognition didn't hit her at first. She smiled politely, the way she always did, ready to greet another customer. But then her eyes narrowed just slightly, and something in her expression shifted. She recognized him, not immediately as a billionaire, but as the quiet man from earlier, who sat in her section watching the world with tired eyes. Then the recognition snapped into place. Her breath caught, her posture changed, not out of fear, but out of shock. Ethan raised his hand gently, the gesture small, almost apologetic, as if asking permission to speak in a space he had no right to disrupt. He told her his name softly, not the name that appears in magazines or headlines, but simply Ethan, hoping the simplicity would ease the tension he felt rising between them. Maya didn't move at first. She stood still, absorbing the truth, the pieces of the morning rearranging in her mind. Ethan explained that he came here under disguise, not to trick her, not to embarrass her, but to understand how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. The words tasted strange coming from him, because they sounded like the kind of experiment a man with too much power and too little humanity would conduct. Her face didn't harden, but it didn't soften either. She just listened, steady and grounded, giving him a space he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. He told her that she had done more in a few hours than he had done in years to remind people how kindness feels. He described how every action she took challenged the system he built, and how every moment of patience from her became a mirror reflecting the flaws in his empire. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't look away. She simply held his gaze with a quiet courage he admired more with every passing second. Ethan felt his throat tighten when he said he had watched her apologize earlier for not being fast enough. He admitted that hearing those words from her made him realize how deeply his company's rules had seeped into people's sense of worth, even those who didn't work for him. He said he wished she never felt that pressure, never felt she had to shrink herself to be seen as valuable. Maya looked down then, only for a breath, as if taking in the weight of what he saw in her that she never meant to reveal. He continued, telling her he had built a world where kindness didn't fit the numbers and where good people were often punished for slowing down to care. He confessed that watching her work tore open something inside him that he had ignored for too long. He admitted that he wasn't just inspired by her kindness, he felt accountable to it. Her eyes widened slightly at that word, because she understood what accountability meant, coming from a man whose decisions shaped thousands of lives. Ethan took a slow breath and told her the truth that had been forming inside him from the moment she placed that kid's dessert beside his plate. He wanted to rebuild everything, his policies, his training, his culture, in a way that reflected her instinctive understanding of people. He wanted his empire to be shaped not by fear or metrics, but by the kind of generosity she offered so effortlessly. If you were Maya, standing in front of a man with that kind of power, admitting he built everything wrong, would you trust his words, or wonder whether he could truly change? Pause for a moment and share what you honestly think, because this is the moment that decides whether his next step is redemption or another mistake. Maya didn't answer him right away. She took a careful breath, letting it settle in her, letting the truth of his confession reach a place deeper than shock. She didn't smile. She didn't question him. She simply said his name softly, grounding the moment with a gentleness that steadied them both. She told him she didn't know what it meant to rebuild something so big, but she believed people deserved better than pressure and fear. Her voice stayed calm, but he heard the strength beneath it. She said, kindness wasn't special. It was survival. People walked into this diner carrying invisible battles, and if she could ease even a little of that weight, she did it, because she knew what it felt like to carry more than anyone noticed. Those words sank into Ethan like an anchor dropping all the way into the deepest part of him. Her truth didn't blame him, but it didn't excuse him either. It simply stood there, asking whether he was willing to be the person who could change something so massive for the sake of people like her, like the family at the bus stop, like the boy he once was. For a moment, he felt awe rise inside him, mixed with a fear that reminded him how easy it is to destroy something and how hard it is to rebuild it the right way. Standing in front of her, he knew the decision he made today would shape not just his future, but the futures of people who would never meet him. He told her he didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't expect trust right away. But he promised he would prove through action, not speeches, that her way of seeing people would become the heart of his company. Maya studied him for a moment, not with suspicion, but with a quiet search for sincerity, and whatever she saw in him made her shoulders soften the smallest bit. It wasn't acceptance, it wasn't agreement. It was the beginning of something fragile but real, the first thread of trust forming between two lives that were never meant to cross, yet somehow needed each other to grow. As Ethan stepped back to give her space, he felt a current move through him, a certainty that everything ahead of him would be harder than anything he had done before. But for the first time, hard didn't mean impossible. It meant necessary. And as Maya nodded subtly, acknowledging the weight of what he had confessed, he knew the next steps would demand more courage than any boardroom battle he ever fought. Something big was coming, and whatever shape it took, his world was already shifting around its force. Ethan walked into the boardroom the next morning carrying the same notebook he closed in the diner, but this time it wasn't a shield or a tool for control. It was a reminder of what he saw, of what he felt, and of what needed to change whether the people in that room liked it or not. The long table was already filled when he arrived, executives scrolling through tablets, glancing at charts, whispering numbers as if the world lived and died by quarterly reports. They greeted him with polished smiles, ready for another meeting they thought they understood. But Ethan didn't sit at the head of the table right away. He stood behind his chair, hands resting lightly on the back of it, looking at each of them with a calm that made several uneasy. Without raising his voice, he told them things were going to change, and he meant all of it. At first they didn't understand. One of them asked if he meant changing marketing. Another wondered if he was referring to internal surveys about employee burnout. A third offered to prepare a presentation on brand loyalty. Their confusion almost made him laugh, not because it was funny, but because it showed exactly how far they had drifted from what mattered. Ethan took a slow breath, and said he wasn't talking about numbers or tests or image. He was talking about the foundation of the company, the culture, the expectations placed on workers who were asked to give more than any person should. He explained that respect had been replaced by pressure, and that kindness had been misread as weakness. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned back, arms crossed, already preparing their arguments. Then one executive, someone who always prided himself on being realistic, chuckled under his breath and said that kindness didn't keep the lights on. The table erupted in soft laughter, the kind that fills a room when people believe they know better than the one speaking. Ethan didn't flinch. He held the man's gaze and repeated something Maya had said word for word. Life is already heavy enough, and people don't need more weight to carry while they're trying to get through the day. The room fell quieter after that, but not out of understanding, out of disbelief. One executive raised an eyebrow and asked if Ethan had spent too much time reading sentimental articles. Another said employees already had too many feelings as it was. Someone else whispered that compassion was a nice idea, but not a profitable one. Ethan felt heat rising in his chest, the same heat that burned inside him at the diner when he heard Maya apologize for not being fast enough. He told them he didn't want a company that punished good people for slowing down to care. He didn't want a handbook that taught fear. He didn't want training sessions that forced workers to upsell tired parents or ignore struggling customers. He wanted something better, something that lifted people instead of breaking them. The room shifted again, not with openness, but with resistance. Some looked confused, others irritated. A few looked genuinely frightened. Changing a culture is harder than building one, and they all knew it. One executive stood and said the company's strength came from structure, pressure, and high expectations. Ethan answered that real strength came from trust, dignity, and fairness. They fired back with numbers. He responded with people. They pointed at profit charts. He pointed at the human cost behind them. And when someone said, almost proudly, that kindness never made a business grow, Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, hearing Maya's voice in the back of his mind, steady and sure. He opened them again with a clarity that cut through every argument in the room. He picked up the old handbook sitting on the table, the same one he had once approved without reading the parts that hurt people the most. There was a silence after that gesture, the kind that reaches through the screen and hits everyone listening at the same time. It's the moment when a lot of people remember the times they stayed quiet at work, or when someone protected them, or when they wished someone had. It's strange how a room full of executives and a story told miles away can create the same pause inside different hearts. Ethan looked down at the handbook and felt years of decisions weighing on it like stones. He lifted it slowly, feeling every page like a memory, then tore it in half with a clean pull that echoed through the boardroom. The sound wasn't loud, but it stunned everyone. Some executives gasped. Others stared at him as if he had lost his mind. But one or two, the ones who had been quiet so far, looked relieved, almost grateful. Ethan placed the torn pieces on the table and said the rules were changing starting now. Not later, not after a study, not after a cost analysis. Now. He told them about Maya without naming her, describing the way she treated people, the way she brought dignity into every interaction, the way she made strangers feel human. He said the company needed to reflect that kind of humanity, or it didn't deserve to stand at all. A few people protested, saying kindness was unpredictable, hard to measure, impossible to scale. Ethan didn't argue. He simply said that humanity wasn't meant to be measured or scaled. It was meant to be respected. He told them he was ready to rebuild everything if that's what it took, and he meant every word. The room was split now, some angry, some inspired, some terrified of what this could mean for their routines or bonuses or sense of power. Ethan didn't blame them. Change scares people who rely on the old rules to stay important, but he stood his ground, steady and unapologetic, feeling something rise in him that felt like courage rediscovered. As the meeting ended, tension hung in the air like thick fog. Some executives left quickly, others lingered, uncertain. A few approached him quietly and asked what the next steps were. He didn't give them a full answer, because he didn't have one yet. All he knew was that the path ahead wasn't safe or easy, but it was right, and right was enough. He walked out of the boardroom with a strange mix of triumph and fear settling in his chest, knowing he had just broken the spine of the old world. What happened next would define everything that followed, and there was no turning back now. Ethan left the boardroom with the torn handbook still echoing in his mind, the sound of it breaking, replaying like a promise he couldn't take back, even if he wanted to. The hallway felt colder than usual, as if the air inside the building wasn't sure what to do with this new version of him. He walked straight to his office without speaking to anyone, ignoring the curious looks from assistants who sensed something unusual had happened behind those heavy doors. Once inside, he closed the door, sat at his desk, and pushed aside every polished award and framed chart that no longer meant anything to him. All that remained in front of him was a blank document on his screen and the notebook he carried from the diner. He opened the notebook gently, as if holding a fragile piece of truth, and stared at the line he wrote hours earlier. "If she worked for me, she'd be reprimanded for this." Those words weren't just a criticism of the system. They were a confession that everything he built had drifted far from the values he once believed made people strong. He opened a new file titled Guidelines and sat still for a long moment, letting the emptiness of the page challenge him the way silence challenges someone who has relied too long on noise. Then slowly he typed the first line: "Treat people like the world is already heavy enough." The sentence looked soft on the screen, almost delicate, but he felt the power inside it. That single idea had carried an entire diner through its hardest moments. It steadied workers, it comforted families, it even broke open a man who thought he was too far gone to learn anything new. He typed the line again at the top in bold, whispering Maya's words to himself as he did. They grounded him in a way no speech or conference ever had. Once the line stood there firmly, he began writing new policies one by one, letting his memories of the diner guide his choices. Respect first, pressure last, human needs above sales targets, outcomes measured not just in profit, but in dignity. And as he wrote, he felt something inside him strengthen, not with pride, but with a hopeful resolve that grew steadier with each sentence. He spent hours drafting, deleting, rewriting. He wasn't building a perfect system, he was building a human one. And he knew that meant facing resistance at every corner. So he sent messages to regional leaders, calling for immediate meetings. He ordered training teams to prepare travel plans. He asked for communication channels to be cleared. The company would not change in one morning, but the first steps would begin today. He didn't care about the cost or the noise or the uncertainty. He cared about making sure the people who woke up tired, scared, overlooked, or rushed would feel something different when they walked into work again. He reread the first page once more, letting the words fill him with the same warmth Maya had given that young dad at the diner. Then he pressed send. The moment he sent those documents out, something shifted, like a quiet warning that every decision from this point on would create ripples he couldn't control. And the people who shared his past vision would not let go of their comfort without a fight. The story wasn't calming down, it was tightening, pulling him toward the moment he couldn't avoid. By noon, Ethan was in the first training video call, explaining why the company was moving in a new direction. Some managers listened with curiosity, others barely hid their skepticism. A few rolled their eyes when they thought the camera wouldn't catch it. He didn't ignore any of it. He told them straight that the old rules were hurting people and that the company had lost its way. He described Maya's kindness without using her name, telling them how one waitress reminded him that service wasn't about squeezing people, but about lifting them. Some responded with thoughtful nods, others with silence, and a few with thinly veiled annoyance. Ethan felt those reactions deep inside, but they didn't weaken him. They fueled him. For every person who resisted, another one opened a little more, realizing that the pressure they had carried for years might finally ease. He scheduled in-person retraining across the country. Teams were sent to meet store managers, talk to workers, and introduce new expectations based not on speed but on support. For the first time in the company's history, employees received materials that told them not to upsell stressed parents, not to rush elderly customers, not to hide their kindness. The early reports came in uneven. Some stores embraced the changes instantly, with workers sharing stories of customers leaving with smiles they hadn't seen in months. Others pushed back, saying the new guidelines slowed down transactions or confused long-time staff. Ethan read every reaction carefully. He knew a change of this size didn't come without discomfort, but he also knew that once people saw the impact of a culture built on compassion, the resistance would begin to lose ground. The more he pushed forward, the more he realized how much of his own identity was tangled in the old system. It wasn't just a company, it was the story of his success, the proof he used to convince himself he had escaped the invisible bus stop where he grew up. Letting go of that story was painful, but holding on to it would be worse, so he reminded himself again why he was doing this. He wasn't fixing a corporation, He was repairing something in himself that he had ignored for far too long. The conversations he had with trainers reflected that shift. He spoke to them not like a CEO defending strategy, but like a man trying to make sure the next generation didn't grow up believing speed mattered more than dignity. As the day stretched into late afternoon, the first signs of real change began to appear. A regional leader sent him a message saying a worker broke down crying after hearing the new guidelines, saying no one had ever told her it was okay to slow down and breathe. Another message described a veteran manager apologizing to his team for years of pushing them too hard. Ethan read those reports quietly, letting the emotion settle deep. He didn't reply right away. He needed a moment to absorb what it meant for people who had waited years for even a little relief. He looked again at the sentence at the top of the new handbook and felt a warmth rise in his chest. Treat people like the world is already heavy enough. That line wasn't just the beginning of a policy. It was the beginning of a new foundation. Something stronger than numbers, something more durable than profit charts, something human. And as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the lights of the city outside his window, he felt a steady quiet inside him, the kind that appears only when a person finally steps onto the path they were meant to take. But even in that quiet, he sensed the next moment forming ahead of him, the moment when he would have to face Maya again, not as a man learning, but as a man ready to show what her kindness set in motion. Ethan pulled into the diner's parking lot before the sun had fully climbed over the roofs. The soft light made the windows glow in a warm, familiar way, and for a moment he just sat there gripping the steering wheel, letting the weight of what he intended to offer settle in his chest. This wasn't a business proposal. This wasn't a reward. This was a turning point for both of them, and he felt it in the tightness in his throat. He glanced at the new handbook sitting on the passenger seat, the first page printed with Maya's words. Treat people like the world is already heavy enough. That line alone had pushed a wave of change through his entire company, and every time he read it, he felt something open inside him, like a door into a quieter, better version of himself. He took a breath, picked up the handbook and stepped out of the car. Inside, the diner looked the same, but it didn't feel the same to him. Every detail carried meaning now. The clatter of plates, the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of soft laughter coming from a booth. And then there was Maya, moving between tables with her easy grace, unaware that the air around Ethan felt charged, almost trembling. When she saw him, she paused mid-step. He noticed the quick shift in her expression, not fear, but the kind of surprise that comes from seeing someone return with purpose. She walked toward him slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, her face open but cautious. He felt his heart beat harder, not from nerves alone, but from a strange mixture of gratitude, awe, and something like honor. He told her he needed to speak with her privately if she had a moment. She nodded and guided him toward a quiet booth near the back, where the morning noise had not yet reached. She sat across from him, leaning in slightly the way she did when she wanted to understand someone fully. He placed the new handbook on the table between them, its cover simple without the glossy shine his company used to prefer. Maya looked at it with a curious tilt of her head, waiting for him to explain. Ethan took another breath, steadying his voice, then told her the truth. He told her that the policies she inspired had already begun reshaping his company, that managers across the country were being retrained, and that employees were finally hearing that their worth wasn't tied to speed or sales pressure. She listened with her full attention, that same quiet presence that once comforted a tired father and calmed a nervous server. Ethan could feel the shift in the air as he spoke, the way every word pulled them closer to something neither had expected when they first crossed paths. He told her he didn't come here to thank her, though he owed her far more thanks than he could express. He came because he couldn't rebuild what was broken alone. He came because she represented the heart he wanted his company to have. When he said her name softly, it trembled a little, carrying more honesty than any speech he had ever delivered. His voice steadied as he told her he wanted her to join the company, not as a face on a poster or a figure for a campaign, but as a leader, someone who would guide teams, shape training, rewrite the culture from the inside, someone who understood people in a way charts never could. Maya blinked slowly, her eyes widening just enough for him to catch the disbelief settling in. She reached out and touched the cover of the handbook lightly, her fingers resting on the place where her own words were printed. For a heartbeat, she didn't speak. She just sat there, absorbing the magnitude of what he was offering her. When she finally raised her eyes again, Ethan felt something warm spread through his chest, like standing in sunlight after a long winter. Maya asked him why her. Her voice wasn't doubtful, just steady, grounded, wanting clarity before stepping into something so big. Ethan answered without hesitation. He told her she had shown him more about leadership in one morning than he had learned in 3 decades. She had reminded him how people should treat each other, how dignity grows from being seen, how kindness could change the entire mood of a room. He said she had helped him rediscover the parts of himself he thought success had burned away. Her eyes softened then, her posture loosening as if those words reached a place inside her she never let strangers touch. She told him she wasn't sure she had the skills for a leadership role. She had never run a team, never sat through corporate meetings, never created policies. But Ethan shook his head gently and told her she already had the most important skill. She knew how to lift people. He could teach her the rest. She leaned back, letting the thought settle, her fingers tracing the edge of the handbook absent-mindedly. A small smile appeared, one filled with humility and something close to wonder. She said she believed kindness could scale if people in power stopped treating it like an obstacle. She said if this role meant she could help workers feel safe and valued, then she was willing to try. For a moment they sat in silence, not tense but peaceful, as if the diner itself paused to witness the shift happening between them. Ethan extended his hand, not as a CEO offering a contract, but as a man offering partnership. Maya looked at his hand, then at him, and placed her hand in his with a quiet certainty that felt stronger than any signature. Their handshake wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, firm, equal. The kind of handshake that marks the start of something new, something built with intention, respect, and hope. Ethan felt a rush of emotion rise in him, a mixture of pride and disbelief, the same feeling someone gets when watching a long fight finally turn toward the light. He saw that same emotion reflected in Maya's eyes, a glimmer of joy she tried not to show too openly. She wasn't accepting this role for status or money. She was accepting it because she believed her kindness wasn't small after all. It could grow, it could teach, it could change. And Ethan realized that this moment wasn't just the result of his transformation. It was the result of hers too. She was stepping into a world that once would have dismissed her, and she was doing it with purpose. As they released each other's hands, the noon sun hit the window beside them, casting a warm golden glow across the table. It felt like the universe painting the moment in its best light. Ethan picked up the handbook and slid it toward her, saying it belonged to both of them now. She accepted it with a nod, her fingers steady, her shoulders lifted with quiet pride. And he knew that everything ahead, the challenges, the resistance, the victories, would be shaped by this moment, this shared decision to build something better. He stood, ready to leave her to finish her shift, but she called his name softly, and when he turned, she simply said, "Thank you," not for the opportunity, but for seeing her. That single sentence stopped him in his tracks, filling his chest with a warmth that almost brought tears he wasn't expecting. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and walked toward the exit, feeling lighter than he had in years. Outside, the light was brighter, the air softer, and for the first time since he started his empire, Ethan felt like he wasn't walking alone. Something new had begun inside both of them, and the story wasn't closing yet. The final step was still waiting, something that would bring every choice, every lesson, every moment to a powerful end. Ethan walked into one of his stores months later, with a feeling he had never associated with his own company before. Not tension, not duty. Something warmer, lighter, almost like stepping into a place built from a memory he didn't know he was allowed to keep. The automatic doors opened, letting in the soft sound of chatter and the smell of fresh pastries drifting from the counter. This wasn't the stiff, rushing world he built years ago. There was a new rhythm inside these walls, a slower heartbeat that matched the way he had learned to breathe again since the morning he met Maya. He paused near the entrance, watching the employees move around each other with calm patience. Small smiles, gentle voices, no sharp edges anywhere. It didn't look rehearsed. It didn't feel forced. It felt lived. He walked farther in, unnoticed at first, and that anonymity felt good. He wanted to see everything without fanfare, to feel the world as it was, not as people wanted him to see it. A young cashier stood at the counter, helping a mother with 2 small kids who were climbing the edges of the cart.